Hello, everyone. Um, well, first, thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure. I'm really excited about the project. And I'm going to try to share my screen with you so that I can show you some visual stuff because most of what I dabble in is visual. So when Richard, Stephen, and I first had our conversations, I would say the two words that we sort of latched onto in Nixon and China were the idea of consequence and community. And I think the idea of community sort of came out of, or the sense of community sort of came out of the idea that we're dealing with a sort of communist framework. We're sort of looking at, how does, like a populist or a sort of communal space work in an opera? How can we sort of take that and structurally use it to our strength? And then the other thing, of course, was consequence, and Stephen talked about this already, sort of like what were sort of what happened after, what was the aftermath, and those are sort of big ideas, and they sort of have interesting implications in terms of how they affect the set. And so when we were sort of figuring out the structure of the entire piece and how we would present it, one of the things that we sort of latched onto was this idea of an envelope of 3 large walls made out of Chinese silk. So here's some research that idea is sort of based on. So we have the idea that there's sort of a repetition in the silks in something that is semi-transparent, can layer just like the music would, because John Adams writes in such a percussive, rhythmic way that sort of recreating that feels incredibly appropriate. So that's one of the big elements that you'll see in the set when we get to the renderings. And the other sort of elements of it are, we sort of lock into the envelope being both, the sort of quintessential Chinese scroll work by repeating sort of multiple images on sort of a vertically justified plane, but we also sort of lock into the grandeur of some of these places, right? You see the repeated elements in flags, you see the repeated elements in columns of sort of a governmental structure, and then you see sort of heavy architecture, which we're sort of using as well. Then the next thing, of course, that we needed to figure out is color. Color plays a huge role in this. I mean, you see in the research itself that red is incredibly important, and then that neutrals sort of let us sit in a sort of ambiguous place at a time, and then red can pull us out. And what was great about that was that we sort of see that some of that in the historical concept too. So I love this picture because it's sort of, it's not really been filtered. This is a picture that is sort of as is, not been doctored at all, and yet we still have these small pops, rhythmic pops of red color popping through in a sort of relatively neutral palette. We see that as well sort of in character work, right? So we have a relatively neutral palette as we move through, and then we have Pat Nixon in her bright red coat standing out. And sort of when does that happen musically? When does that happen in terms of character? When does that happen in the stage picture? That kind of, so that's one of the many things that we're sort of exploring with this design. And I'm also doing projections. So one of the other things that we've locked onto with projections is sort of the overarching idea of Chinese lattice work or Chinese trellis work. And this sort of explores the concept of consequence and of character by sort of both being rhythmic, because we've got a lot of repetition and form, but we also sort of see that paths are created and they move through in a sort of labyrinthian way. They move through space and they cross each other and they diverge from each other at different times. And it sort of is a nice way for us to sort of take projections, justify them to an overall idea, because we sort of have a very structured type of lattice on one side, and then there's another type of Chinese lattice which is more fractured. And so there's emotional resonance that's connected to the sort of visual forms here. So this sort of feels very formal, and then this sort of starts to break apart and suddenly feels a bit more organic, and we're going to try to use that to our benefit. So those are all some great ideas, and they sort of coalesced into a design that looked like this. So this is one of the earlier scenes that I've sketched out in Nixon in China. This would be right after after Air Force One has landed, and it's the greeting. So we sort of see multiple different elements of what I've talked about at play here. We've got the large side silk panels that form a projection screen. We've got a sense of community, as the chorus is probably going to be on stage for at least 90% of this opera. So everybody has a place, everybody has a spot, and chairs on risers. We've got sort of these large, heavy, brutalist architectural screens that we use for projections as well. And we're sort of using the lattice work to frame specific elements that we find in the historical research. For when Nixon landed in China, they landed on an airfield that had these panels with the Chinese lettering on it. So this is the sort of part in Act 2, which is sort of the opera within the opera, if you will. And for that, we introduced the idea of red silks, which sort of give it a grandeur, and we give it a sort of sense of theatricality for that moment. The other sense that we're going to be doing in this moment is we're also sort of trying to turn the entire space into the sort of communal area, because we'll also be deploying red silks in the house, in the audience. So that's sort of an element of not only is there community on stage, but suddenly just by the nature of us seeing this theater experience, we join the community that's happening on stage. We're part of the performance in a certain sense. And then here we have the sort of very end. So one of the things about Act 3 is that it feels structurally incredibly different from the first two parts. And one of the ways we want to emphasize that is by removing all of the silks. So the idea that there's something, that there's suddenly less there, speaks to the consequence of the moment as well, right? You pull down a silk, it falls to the ground, and suddenly you've created a vacuum, or a void, essentially. So that's one of the big ideas of consequence that is sort of existent in the set, is that, you know, things are done and they can't necessarily be undone. Once a silk has been pulled down from the framework, it cannot be hung up again.